This is Judge Joe Brown, and you're watching We All Be News TV, the
News-free Dixie.
news-free Dixie for the 21st century.
Well, We All Be is under the help of the one and only Brother AndREw Ward, who is the author of The River Run Red, which concerns the Fort Pillow Massacre of 1864. Been in dispute about what really happened that day on April 12th, 1864. But Mr. Ward wrote a book about that, which goes into great details on both sides, very balanced, objective look at that massacre, at that dark moment in American history. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fine. I'm happy to be on your show. I appreciate your introduction. I certainly set out to write a fair and balanced book about it, but I did end up concluding that there was a massacre, that it was a battle that had metastasized into a massacre after the garrison left the fort. But maybe I could just sort of briefly describe what happened at the battle, and we could take it from there.
That sounds great, sir. Yes, sir. You read my mind.
Okay. All right. Good. In 1864, there were a great many African American soldiers recruited by the Union, and these were mostly slaves who had escaped from their masters and gone into the Union lines. And they were especially important to the Union because as the Union pressed eastward with the march to the sea with Sherman, he took with him a lot of the veteran white troops, and he needed black troops to hold down the fort in a lot of the Union positions in the West, or what was called the West, along the Mississippi. And one of the forts that was garrisoned with black troops, about half black troops and half white troops, was Fort Pillow, which is right on the Mississippi. I can't quite remember the exact amount, but I think it's about 40 crowfly miles from Memphis. Mm-hmm. And they were not supposed to be there. The General Hurlbut, who was a very corrupt Union officer in Memphis, had been told by Sherman before Sherman left not to waste any time manning a series of forts actually along the way, but Fort Pillow especially. But Hurlbut was terrified of Nathan Bedford ForREst, and with good reason. ForREst was a Confederate cavalry commander. He was his theater was primarily, at least at this point, in Western Tennessee, and he had been an extremely effective, almost like a guerrilla fighter, guerrilla warrior, but he was an ingenious fellow. But he also had the worst resume of any general on either side, in the sense that he was a slave catcher as a constable in Mississippi. He was a slave owner. He was a slave dealer, a very successful one in Memphis. And then after the war, he became a pioneer of the convict labor system, and also he actually killed one of his black laborers with an axe, claiming he was the laborer had come after him, and then he helped to found the Ku Klux Klan. Nevertheless, there are a great many people who defend him, partly because there's a shortage of heroes in that theater of the war, and I think partly because people, the people who don't want to ascribe the Civil War to a war over slavery, but claim only that it was a war over tariffs or a clash of two cultures. They are, they have to jump through a lot of hoops to try to prove that ForREst was not a racist and that he would not have condoned the killing of black troops who had already surrendered. In any case, on a blustery morning, he and his troops attacked Fort Pillow from the land side. Fort Pillow was basically designed to protect the river, and so all the guns and everything were aimed in that direction. And he had an overwhelmingly force, but the Fort Pillow garrison was determined to fight it out. And despite ForREst's threats that if they did not surrender, he would not hold himself responsible for the result, and he certainly didn't. When after a truce during which his soldiers advanced on the fort, they attacked and quickly overcame the fort, and a great many soldiers, both black and white, fled down to the river, threw down their weapons, and begged for mercy. And a great many of them, the number is a matter of controversy, but a great many of them were killed after they had thrown down their weapons. And a lot of people, there are people who say that never happened. Mm-hmm. There are people who say that ForREst was not responsible for it happening, if it did happen, because he was tied up trying to use a gun against a Union gunboat out of the river. Mm-hmm. Anyway, but it became an enormous scandal during the war. The radical Republicans, who really were out to destroy the South as much as they possibly could, sent an investigative commission down to find out what had happened. They came up with a report that I found largely accurate after having checked out the testimony of a great many of the troops involved. There's a lot of talk about the accounts being contradictory, but they're no more contradictory than anybody's testimony is apt to be. And I found much evidence of backing up the fundamental issue that this was a battle that turned into a massacre, and for which ForREst never took the blame. Neither did his cavalry commander, who then went on to demonstrate what a gentleman he was by killing about 40 blacks who were trying to protect their sheriff, a black sheriff who had taken over during Reconstruction. It seems to me symptomatic of the deprecation of the influence and pervasiveness of slavery, that people who really don't understand the dimension of slavery and the effect it had not only on slaves but on white society in the South. I think that has a lot to do with the denial that that this massacre took place. There were many other massacres along the way in the war, but this one had a special place because it was so heavily publicized. And I've gone on much too long, and let's hear your question.
No. I mean, it's fine. You answered. I was going to ask you about were the investigation, were the reports from the investigation accurate? Just reading the primary sources and also the New York Times article, I want to know how accurate they were. Were they really accurate? Or were they exaggerated? You said it was like pretty much.
I think there's certainly moments when there are exaggerations. There were, it was a terrible time in the sense that you had the racism of the Confederates, and you had the corruption of the Union Army in the West, and so nobody comes off looking terribly good except the soldiers themselves. The testimony that the commission collected was held up to as proof that there had been a massacre. The South never did any investigation of its own into what happened. They simply accepted ForREst's account or his officer's account. He never collected testimony from any of his underlings. It was all, I don't mean underlings. I mean privates, his enlisted men, and I think there was good reason for that, and that was because he wanted to control how this was reported, and he could count on his officers to toe the line. That it was really the fault of the Union garrison, that the officers had tried to stop it. At the same time, they're saying there wasn't any it to stop. So it was there was a concerted effort on the Confederate side to deny this had ever happened, because it would have been such a scandal, and it was also at a time when they were still hoping that the British might help the Confederate cause in the name of keeping the cotton business going, and that if this was accepted as gospel, then the British would turn their backs on the Confederacy, which they eventually did, of course. So yes, I found it extremely. I found that the testimony held up well, and partly also because I found so much corroborating evidence in pension records and prisoner records. There's a wonderful file at the National Archives called the Ration Commutation File. A lot of people don't know about it. It's a file that was kept or it was a program to reimburse men who had been captured during the war and therefore did not receive the rations from and their pay from the Union. And what was great about that was that several of the survivors of the Fort Pillow affair, and there were maybe a dozen, out of 200 or 300 who were killed in the battle. There were several of them had applied for these rations and then had therefore given an account of themselves at the battle and after it, and how they were treated. They were treated as slaves, of course. There was some, there was some exaggeration about what happened on the part of the Union. One of the reports was that the Confederates lynched every survivor along the road from Fort Pillow to their next destination. That was, I think, nonsense. And the reason it was nonsense is not because of some humanity on the part of the Confederates under ForREst. but it was because black people were regarded as labor and slaves, and they were increasingly valuable as slaves, as many slaves deserted their masters. So these men were sent down to work on rebel fortifications down on along the coast, but again and again, there were. I think another reason ForREst didn't want to interview his men was that those who did write home about what happened described a massacre. There were two particular accounts. One by a sergeant who just said how ashamed he was of the behavior of his troops. Most of them Missouri troops, I think, who had been left behind to watch over the fort as ForREst and the rest of his troops marched on. In any case, it was everything in history is a muddle, just because everything in human affairs is a muddle. Mm-hmm. But there is enough evidence for me to have concluded, and I didn't conclude this eagerly, because my children, my wife is the daughter of a Tennessee woman, and in the coursing in my children's veins is the blood of several of the soldiers who took part in the massacre on the Confederate side. I didn't want that. I didn't want to conclude what I concluded, but it just seemed to me so obvious, and that the arguments against its having happened seemed so strained and dependent on such curious material that I ended up writing what I hoped was balanced, but ended up very adamantly concluding that it was indeed a massacre.
I got to ask you this: how did your wife feel about it, or her relatives, or your relatives, rather?
Well,
I want to know their response to that.
Yeah, well, that was rather late in the game that I realized that, because I found that a couple of people named Bowles, Debbie's grandmother had been a Bowles from Buchanan County, and they were they were not happy to find this out. Fortunately, it sounds terrible, but my mother-in-law had passed on by the time this was published. My kids, I don't know if it really penetrated them. Their identification and association has been, basically Northern, in the sense they were born in Connecticut and lived in Seattle and California. But it was, for me, it was a painful thing to discover.
Wow. I mean, did any of her relatives talked about their participation in Fort Pillow? With any diaries left around or letters?
No, I looked high and low for that. I think a lot of letters were destroyed because of the shame that attached to this. There was very few people know, for instance, that at the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederates who were roaming around the countryside were picking up free blacks, Pennsylvania freedmen, and carting them back down south when they fled after the defeat at Gettysburg. This happened all over the country, and again, it's just one of those things that rather than deny it, it's important for people to try to understand it, to come up with it. But I can't claim it's easy. The history of slavery and its aftermath is an indigestible lump for people who were raised, thinking of America as the land of opportunity and decency and so on. It's really hard to reconcile that idealistic feeling about the country with, what happened to African Americans and what happened to Native Americans. But you have to do it. You have to, if you're ever going to understand this country, you have to. I sound pious about it, but I realized as I was doing this work on not only Fort Pillow, but I wrote a history of the Jubilee Singers from Nashville, and then after I had encountered so many accounts of the Civil War in the words of former slaves, I then wrote, after River Run Red, I wrote a book called The Slaves' War. And it was an account of the Civil War, a history of the Civil War in the words of former slaves. And I managed to find former slaves who had witnessed just about every aspect of the war from the ground level, from the back porches and the fence lines in the South. There are stories about human resilience and resistance that one wants to take pride in, even though it was people of my race who were the oppressors. But if you start to actually embrace everybody who's an American, you can begin to lay claim to some sense of pride in the way, well, in figures like Lincoln, who I know it's unpopular to say so, but he was a man who gradually but steadily changed his mind about a great many things, and worked hard to make sure that he would win the war, without which he could never emancipate slaves.
Right.
So anyway, I'm rambling here a little bit, but it just became incredibly important to me to face up to this history as accurately as I could, and to try to understand, how that history continues to play itself out in the incarceration of Black people, in the ill treatment by the police, disproportionate numbers of African Americans in the armed forces, the way labor workers are treated. There's just the pockets of poverty within the Black community. It's once you sort of see this history and how corrosive and also how dominant it was, you begin to you begin to come to grips with what this country is, and the importance of pursuing the ideals that are stated in by our founding fathers, who of course many of whom were slaveholders.
Right. And that's why there's no statue of Thomas Paine in Washington, D.C., because he was the only one that called them out on it. Like being hypocrites about owning slaves and about freeing humanity. I mean, there's no statue of Thomas Paine. There's no streets. There's no schools. They lost his body even.
Okay.
He was the only one of the founding fathers I really, really respected.
Yeah.
Because he knew the power of the word and also the power of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you this, because I think it's so fascinating, because a lot of us don't know this story at all. So I want to thank you for taking the time to write about it and to expose people, because I have went to the Bedford ForREst birthday rallies. It takes place every year in Memphis, the Sunday before his birthday, which is July 13th. Every year, the governor proclaims him as a hero of Tennessee. They issue a state proclamation. Now, we got Haslam, he's the billionaire governor of Tennessee. But every year, they proclaim him as a state hero. And every year, they have a rally on that Sunday before his birthday. His birthday, July 13th. And I actually went to two of these rallies last year and the year before. When the incident happened in Charleston when Mother Emanuel had them 9 Black people get killed by Dylan Roof. And it's interesting because how people, it's like a lot of cognitive dissonance. Like, people will say, well, I interview these folks and I made it available online, and people will say stuff like, ForREst wasn't even there. His horses fell on him. How could he be accountable for what they did? And ForREst was like, somebody even told me that Nathan Bedford Forrest was a civil rights leader, and that him and Dr. King would have been friends. The irony of which is that Dr. King was killed in Memphis, and Nathan Bedford Forrest not buried too far from where they killed Dr. King.
Yep. If you run into that, let me just run a few things through by you about Forrest. Yes, there are. His defenders say that he was a too brave and too honorable a man to have ever committed this sort of outrage. They say that he was a kindly slave dealer. Now that's that's not they talk about cognitive dissonance. They said that he never separated families. I found several witnesses who said that in fact they had been slaves in his dealership, and that he had indeed separated women from their children, and on and on. They said that he was so gentle a slave dealer that he allowed many slaves to go out and find people to purchase them in Memphis, in the neighborhood. Well, that could be, you can interpret that as kindliness. The other interpretation is that they were so terrified of Nathan Bedford Forrest that they wouldn't even contemplate trying to run away, because it was Forrest and his brothers, and they were all tough frontiersmen and horsemen, and any slave who tried to run away from Nathan Bedford Forrest would be either killed or tortured. There's all this stuff. They say that he was a civil rights leader because he delivered 2 speeches to black audiences. It was a black fraternal organization, had a picnic, and he appeared. I can't remember what the other one was. And in it, he said, we're all Southerners. We are all, sons of this soil. And if you would just trust the men who understand you and who have taken care of you over the over the years. I can't make this stuff up.
Right.
If you would just trust in us and allow us to organize things for your benefit, then the South will rise again. Well, I think probably the audience was appreciative of his making this. At least making a stab at that. But what he was worried about was black people were leaving the South in droves, and he was worried that he was going to run out of laborers. And he did run out of laborers so much that he ended up making a deal with the local prison to let him run a prison farm on an island in the middle of the Mississippi. So, all these things that they use to sort of soften his image turned out, at least from my research, to be nonsense. He was a tough guy. There is a family. I'm sorry. It's been so long since I wrote this book. I can't remember everybody's name. But there's a man who was a founder of the American Negro Theater in New York, who informed me that he was descended from Nathan Bedford Forrest. And I said, how can that be? And he said, well, because Forrest had a favorite black slave whom he impregnated. She ran away after he left to go fight Confederacy. She went down to Texas. And there's a family in Texas who descend from Nathan Bedford Forrest and this woman, and who and I said, people hearing that are going to sort of think that, well, that there's no proof of that, is there? And he said, I'll tell you what. He said, if there's anybody on earth I would not want to be descended from, it's Nathan Bedford Forrest. So you can't accuse me of trying to suck up to Nathan Bedford Forrest. And so. He was in the mold. He was a tough guy. Even in Virginia, even in Richmond, or among the gentlemen's the gentleman's generals thought of him as a ruffian and would never give him much credit, even when he was very successful. And he was, I think, the most successful cavalry officer there was. He was. The contradiction is, I don't feel there is a contradiction between being a great warrior, willing to cut people down with your saber, cut off their heads as you're riding into a swarm of enemy of cavalry. There's no contradiction between that and being a son of a bitch as a civilian.
Right. That's true. You talk about ForREst. I like how you described him in your C-SPAN presentation, but when you're just talking right now, I'm thinking he's like a mixture between Clint Eastwood, John Wayne, and Earl Flynn. That's what I'm thinking. Like, he's just made for that type of role. Yeah.
In the way that's right. In the way they imagine him, that's right. As a heroic figure. But he was, and he was heroic in the sense of being a very brave and very resourceful, clever officer. I mean, there's just no question about his skill as a military man. But it's you have to understand that it's quite possible to be that and also be a racist and a slave dealer who did separate families. And I don't know. I start to get kind of worked up with this stuff because I did encounter various sons of the Confederacy who felt that I had besmirched him. I didn't set out to besmirch him. I didn't know anything about him when I started out with the story. But the more I found out from, not just from Union sources, which of course would be savage against him, but a lot of other sources, civilian, former slaves who knew him. There were slaves he had sold who had then escaped to the Union lines and were serving in the garrison. So he recognized, and they recognized him. Several of the survivors mentioned this, that they recognized him because they'd been sold in his slave yard. One of a slave who was working as a cook for ForREst came upon the body of his nephew. It was a ghastly collision of cultures, and I just I used to be, as a boy, I was fascinated by the Civil War. Now I just see it as this political failure, and moral failure. It was just it arose out of the inability of our politicians to belly up to the wrongs, the sin of slavery. To put it that way.
It's almost like a Pandora box when you start talking about the Civil War.
That's right.
In particular, because it goes so many ways, but with ForREst, it's funny you talk about him. Like, there was President's Island in Mississippi River between Arkansas and Memphis. He had that black. Cause I was telling them in the rally last year, I said, don't y'all know that your hero Nathan Bedford ForREst is the father of private prisons? That's the way I put it. And so I never heard of that before. I got to investigate that. What are you talking about, President's Island?
Yeah.
I said, they right here. And on Adams Street where he had his slave market, it's the home now juvenile court. And they have some corrupt.
Right?
The same place where he had his slave market, that street, Adams Street, is the home of juvenile court. And we got one of the most corrupt juvenile courts in the history of the country. And so that's just a living legacy. Even the corporate headquarters for private prison is in Nashville, the CCA.
Yeah.
So that's just a living legacy he has. Cause I don't see what good it was to dig him up from Elmwood Cemetery. Cause now the person in his plot, I believe, is the historian Shelby Foote. He's buried in that plot where ForREst was buried at, I believe, in Elmwood Cemetery of all people. And to help him dig up
Shelby Foote was a great storyteller and a very, very good, very good historian, I have to say, except that he did have this blind spot.
Right.
This kind of man, macho image of ForREst as just a man's man, and and he never, I thought, never penetrated in his books the fundamentals of the fundamental context of slavery in the South. He just never. It's not part of the story for him. It's all individuals, and it's it was useful to have a great writer write from the Southern point of view, but the Southern point of view. The Southern white point of view, I always make that mistake of saying Southern when I'm talking about whites, is can be kind of blind to this miserable context in which all of this transpired.
It's like a going with the wind mentality. It's like they try to make it romanticize it too much. It's too romantic, not brutal. I mean, they try to make Forrest into Robert E. Lee, who was a gentleman. In some respects, he was educated and refined, quote unquote, blue blood, aristocracy type of speaking dude. And this guy's a backwoods dude, and he a self-made man, a frontier man, because Tennessee was the West Side back then. No disrespect to California, but my thing also with Forrest, what they try to do is they try to say he wasn't really present when the quote unquote things got out of hand. I always employ the Charles Manson argument, meaning that Charles Manson wasn't there when his followers slit Sharon Tate up and her friends, but he still is held accountable. It's like if I go to Chick-fil-A, if the cashier is not treating me right or the people, I gotta take it with the manager, and it reflects poorly on the culture of the organization. So I gotta look at the leadership. So Forrest, even if he left the Missouri folks in charge, he's still responsible.
Let me clear that one up, because he was there when most of the atrocities were committed.
Okay.
He was, as far as I could tell, he was up on the bluff, working with a cannon.
Mm-hmm.
This is from a Confederate soldier's account.
Interesting.
He was up working a cannon and trying to take pot shots at a Union gunboat that was out in the middle of the river, and making its way across to the other side as fast as it could. I think you could say that he was at the very least guilty of negligence in not really giving a damn what was going on down below him in the along the riverside where people were being shot down. And he had a what's his name in this
Chalmers.
Chalmers, thank you very much. That's exactly right. Chalmers, some people deprecate one of the witnesses, one of the black witnesses, for saying that he saw Forrest riding through riding along the river, and in fact, Chalmers was a miniature version of Forrest. I mean, he would have easily been mistaken for Forrest, and Chalmers did nothing to stop it. And it wasn't until the sort of officer mentality took over, saying, "Wait a minute, don't kill all these Negroes. We need them. We need them for labor." That things started quieting down. But then Forrest left, and he left that evening, and that night there were further atrocities. Not the worst of them, or not the most of them, but further atrocities where wounded soldiers were murdered, and several buried alive. At least I was never positive about that, but apparently that's what they testified to. So the Missourians were not being officered during that period. They were free to do whatever they wanted to do, and so they set fire to a tent full of wounded soldiers, and there's ghastly stuff that I don't need to go into, but that argument goes against military philosophy, which is that if you're the commander, you're responsible.
Yeah, that's all letter is attributed to Abraham Lincoln when he called it a massacre. He basically said it was a massacre, but it's like you said, the Civil War was a political and moral mess. I know a lot of the Forrest supporters and apologists said that if he was guilty, General Sherman would have killed him. I said, well, General Sherman, with all due respect to him, He had no moral authority. I mean, you look at what happened with his marches and even Devil Punch Bowl down in Natchez, the Devil Punch Bowl thing. We out them slaves or contraband, as they called it, when they got sick with malaria. He threw about 20,000 African slaves down into this pit near the Mississippi River on his orders. You know, the Devil Punch Bowl. Are you familiar with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm saying,
not intimately,
but Camp Douglas in Chicago, they always talk about Andersonville in Georgia, but look at Camp Douglas in Chicago. So how can the Union be the moral authority over the Confederacy if they doing the same thing?
Well, they were doing the same. You know, yeah, absolutely. There were terrible things that happened as a result of Union negligence and corruption and so on. There were Union officers in various garrisons who, when slave owners came to find their escaped slaves, accepted money to and handed over the slave. And so that kind of thing went on. I think it's important, though, to make some distinction between people coming out of a slave society and people coming out of a non-slave society. As certainly there were, soldiers who said, no, I'm not fighting to free slaves. I'm fighting for the Union, or I'm fighting for $15 a month or whatever they paid. But eventually that's what became the moral core of the Union cause. It may not have started out that way. I think Lincoln was far-sighted enough to know that that's what was going to be the end result of this catastrophe, of this war, that slavery would be extinguished with the Southern cause. But he was not ready to declare that as the fundamental cause because he couldn't afford to lose the Upper South. He couldn't afford to lose Kentucky. He couldn't afford to lose Maryland, places that were held slaves. He had to play a terrible game. There was a lot of, I think that the movie Lincoln sort of shows what tawdry politics he had to engage in order to do something right. And that's kind of a lesson for any politician, is that compromise and making deals is part of the deal, is part of the dynamic of a democracy, as tawdry as it sometimes looks. I think the approach to the approach to those episodes, I think it's different. They're different in some ways. Certainly. I'm sorry. Sherman couldn't have killed Nathan Bedford ForREst because he was awful hard to kill.
Right. He was the devil.
He was hard. He was the devil. I mean, Sherman just thought he was the devil incarnate. How did he manage to win over and over again with fewer men? I mean, he was ingenious. He'd do the old Hollywood trick, or may have even invented it, of getting his troops up on a ridge up above the Union position, and then he would have them ride in a circle to make it look like he had thousands and thousands of troops. Wow. And he got people to surrender on the basis of that. And they also say, well, if he was guilty, why didn't Lincoln have him executed, or why didn't the Union have him executed after the war? I can't quite excuse the fact that he wasn't prosecuted after the war, but that wasn't the name of the game at that point. That they just barely put Jefferson Davis in jail. They never jailed Robert E. Lee. They would, and it never. I just don't think they saw it they saw the reconciliation between the North and the South as a more important thing than a reconciliation between whites and blacks. I mean, I think that was fundamentally true.
Okay. And also, I was thinking about what you just saying that if war is held, there are no saints in war. And if like Colin Powell was on a morning show a couple of years ago, I'll never forget what he said. He said, when you could declare war, you call off civilization.
Yep.
You declare, so it really can't have a war crime if you fighting to win at all costs by any means necessary.
Yeah.
Is there such thing as a war crime?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but it seems to be more true, truer and truer. I mean, I think, I think in general, the generals on both sides were horrified by the notion that men who were surrendering were killed. That goes against what passes for military justice, standards of behavior. How often those standards are applied, is more and more problematic as warfare gets more technical.
Look what happened last night in Syria, right? With us.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, it's been, as I say, it's been quite a long time since I wrote my book. But it's
so relevant now more than ever, considering how it happened since it first came out. If you think about where the country is now, we didn't even have our so-called first president of a color then when it came out, and so much stuff has happened since then with the Ferguson and a lot of stuff been going on is unresolved. Some people would say the Civil War never stopped. We still fighting the Civil War. Yep.
My mother-in-law said that when she was a student, she went to tell the dean at some Southern university that she was going to go to Yale to learn to be a nurse, and the dean said, Ms. Upchurch, if where I come from, damn Yankee is one word. I mean, there's just and there's tremendous bitterness. It's a whole culture built around the fact that, ancestors were actually defeated, and it is hard to swallow that, and it's hard to swallow what followed in the sense of the poverty in the South after the war. Mississippi was the richest state in the Union before the war, and the poorest immediately after the war.
Wow!
Because its riches were in slaves and the lands that the slaves labored in. I've often thought that somebody who's a cartographer should come up with an atlas of that would show Americans how many places in the United States you can trace back to black labor, unpaid slave labor, the roads, the walls, the Capitol building, Broadway in New York.
Oh yeah, New York City, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, just that it would be, I think, an eye opener for some people to just see how much the country owed and owes to people who were caught up in that awful institution. And then when people tell me how impatient they are hearing about, black, complaints about injustice and so on, I say, listen, pal, we still have another 100 years to go before this country will have been free of slavery for as long as it had slavery. And that, that it seems to me is, it shows that there's going to be unfinished business, and we got to work hard to right some of those wrongs. I wish there were a way to, I wish the whole notion of paying descendants was possible politically. I don't think it's going to be, but it certainly is plausible morally, it seems to me.
I think in the future it might be, within 100 years it might happen.
It might.
I mean, I'm looking at how the young people they got to know about this history. That's why what you did with this book and us talking about 4 pillars is so relevant today, because you got to know why we got to compensate the descendants of these slaves. Because I know I visited the grave of Dred Scott last fall, and which is interesting is William Sherman is actually buried in the same cemetery, him and his family with Dred Scott, and it's like outside of Ferguson, Missouri. I call it Missouri. I don't call it Missouri. I call it Missouri. And Dred Scott was told by Roger Taney, you have no rights that the white man is bound to respect you or your descendants. I mean, I'm a descendant of Dred Scott, so I have no rights. I might be an American, but I'm not a citizen. It was never intended. There's the thing about even with the slavery thing, it was never abolished. It made room. That's why we got private prisons. Now they're talking about closing Rikers Island after all these generations and decades. But look at, it's so much to go through. So, like, I like going down and talking with these apologists and supporters of ForREst. I even interviewed his, I think, great-great-grandson, who's a fire chief, I was told, in Memphis by a fireman, of all people. He has some interesting words to say. But my thing is, I want to ask you a couple of things I think is very important. I want to get this out there, because what the supporters of ForREst told me is that Nathan BEdford ForREst had a special all-black escort detail known as the Green Berets. Is that true? That's what they tell me. I promise you. I know you laughing about it, but they've been telling me this. No, I want to know from your research.
No, that's not. I've found absolutely no evidence of that at all. He was he had black people, servants, for officer servants, various others. I already told you he had a black cook who was widely thought to be his mistress. There were certainly blacks.
They don't talk about that at all. I'm going to bring that up with them too.
But they're not green. They weren't Green Beret, warriors. There's a great big Southern whites make a certain Southern whites. I don't mean to say that blanket, because I met a lot of people when I was touring in the South with this book who were really appalled by this by the story and
I saw the C-SPAN presentation.
Deeply troubled about it. But the sort of Sons of Confederacy people, they make a big deal out of the fact that at one point, that there were blacks who wore Confederate uniforms and fought. Well, there weren't many of them. What their motivations were, what they were promised in exchange for doing that. Just to talk about the Black Confederates, there's a book about them. It doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up. Buckner, General Buckner, who surrendered. Here I go. Just an old man's brain. But anyway, General Buckner.
Shiloh? Was it Shiloh? Was he at the Battle of Shiloh? Was Buckner at the Battle of Shiloh? Okay.
Well, he may have been, but I'm thinking about the fort up on the Ohio River. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He proposed to the Confederate Congress that they offer emancipation to blacks who would fight for the Confederacy. The Congress turned him down and said that it was that would violate everything that they stood for. So that stuff, those excuses and those attempts to soften the edges of that history are, I think, are going to lead people down terrible paths of hypocrisy and distortion. And I always felt a little self-conscious as a Northerner coming down and lecturing Southerners about it, but it seemed to me somebody had to.
It'd be it's like Malcolm said, anything south of Canada is the South. So everybody, this whole country benefited from the Institute of Slavery, even the Ivy League schools, Brown University, Harvard, all of them.
Columbia,
even insurance companies, Aetna,
and they're just beginning to acknowledge that. Absolutely, my wife's grandfather on her father's side was an insurance man from Hartford, and as I was doing initial research in African American history, I discovered that the insurance companies, I think Fireman's was one of them, they would send agents to slave sales the way you'd sell car insurance, and you could get a policy on a slave after you purchased a slave. The only thing it wouldn't guarantee you was that they would pay you anything if the slave killed himself.
It must happen a lot of times, more than once, like slaves killing themselves.
And that's up in that's Hartford, Connecticut. The Huntington family, my wife's father's family, had always, their joke had always been that he was a Yankee and his wife was this Connecticut chicken farmer's daughter.
Right.
And so you had this squeaky clean abolitionist Yankee and this slave holding. Well, no, I looked up the records. Her family never owned slaves, and his family were slave dealers in New London, Connecticut.
That's something.
So you just, everywhere you look, it creeps out of the every closet you open, there's something in there. I just find it fascinating to the way people try to deny the pervasiveness of that institution.
Yeah, it's like what Lucky Luciano said: behind every great wealth, there's a great crime. And I was at a parole hearing for my cousin recently, who he's been in jail for he's basically forfeited his 20s and mid 30s to be in jail for drug dealing and whatnot. And the parole hearing, the person that was hearing his parole was saying, well, you deal drugs. I chose to go to college, and he let the family speak, and I had to say my piece. I said, with all due respect, sir, one of our greatest presidents, Franklin Roosevelt, his maternal grandfather made a family fortune by dealing opium to the Chinese. One of the biggest drug dealers in American history. You can't refute that. So, this country, all money is blood money. But my thing is this: I want to ask you this, because this something happened to me when I was a freshman in college. I'll never forget this as long as I live. I went to a Scholar in the Arts banquet. I went to Washington University in St. Louis on an art scholarship, on a John B. Irvin scholarship, a full scholarship. And it was at the Scholar in the Arts banquet in my freshman year. I kind of one of the biggest donors to the art school. We started a conversation, this white man, and he was into baseball, and he started talking about the Civil War. And I told him I was from Memphis and stuff like that, and he see that we could carry a conversation. So he asked me a question. He said, "Do you know who my favorite person from the Civil War is?" I said, "No, sir. Who is it?" He said, "BEdford ForREst." I said, "Okay." Like maybe telling a Jewish person my favorite person is Hitler or something like that. But I asked, I just got quiet, and I asked him, why is he your favorite person? He said, well, because he was a military genius and all this other stuff. It's kind of like, how people always talk about the greatness of ForREst, but he never touched upon being the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Because I knew about him being the first Grand Wizard. I knew about the Fort Pillow Massacre only because when I was in elementary school, when I was 10 years old, my grandma had this old World Book Black History encyclopedia. I used to read it all the time. So I already knew about Fort Pillow and Jake Nathan before I got out of elementary school. They're not teaching this in school.
That's great.
But it's interesting. What's your take on that? So man, why he told me this? What do you think his reason for telling me that? Was it to intimidate me or try to figure me out?
Yep. There's a lot of that, and a lot of just wanting to be a little bit nasty about all that history. There's a kind of satisfaction about being, I told a man who was driving me into Memphis from the airport. He was a husband of a woman who was giving me a book tour, and I said, ForREst had his slave yard was right there on Market Street, and he laughed, and he said, "Oh, I love that shit," or something like that. And I just thought, excuse my language.
No, you good.
And I just said, what, so what's funny? And he said, "Oh, I just love it." And I think there are people who take a certain pride in the fact that their ancestors had such a total power over other human beings. And I think it's human nature to some degree. Right. It's not a good piece of it, but I think there is some of that. There's a sort of residual feeling that those were the days, when the white man was on, the top of the world. The best reparations argument I ever came upon was written by Jefferson Davis.
Oh, really?
He said to slavery we owe to slaves we owe the settling of this country, the cultivation of our fields, the building of our roads, and our our prosperity.
Wow,
That's Jefferson Davis.
Wow.
I'm not quoting him directly, but that was the gist of it. And he talked like that until he realized that the British didn't want him to talk like that, and so he told his administration not to talk about slavery anymore, but let's just talk about the Union invading our land and trying to take away our way of life and so on. Alexander Stephens, though the vice president, was equally adamant about the value of slavery to the development of the country. But Jefferson Davis, you could if you can find that quote and carry it around with you. It's the ultimate. It's the ultimate answer to all of this. This is how we did it. We stole the land from the Indians and we worked it with slaves.
And Jefferson Davis was no mental midget. He was a true, what they call, patriot. I mean, he really was distinguished before he went to the Confederacy.
Yeah, he was. Well, yeah, he was
accomplished, I guess you'd say.
He was accomplished. He was a gentleman. He had gone to, he got a pretty good education in Kentucky, I believe. He and his brother ran a plantation that was probably the most humane, if I can use that word, in the South. They had slaves who invented various things, and they would sort of honor the invention there was just, they were somewhat more enlightened about it. That's all I can say.
Like Eli Whitney
it was also the wealthiest plantation in Mississippi, which made it very, very wealthy indeed. But he had this romantic notion that without this wonderful institution that's turning the rest of the South into an Athens. They were always using classical history as a justification that the Romans had slaves, the Greeks had slaves, and look what marvelous imperial civilizations they were, and we're going to be the same. This is going to free us up for dancing.
Well, that's fascinating. It was like romanticism, but also it was honesty there. It was a truthfulness to what he was saying as well too. He tried to make it sound very poetic at times.
He was defending slavery as an institution and said we wouldn't be anywhere without it, and
that's true.
And that's true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to just ForREst, before I let you go. I really enjoyed talking to you. You got so much information. I want to encourage people to read your book, The River Run Red. It's available. What's the best way? I mean, Amazon and all.
Amazon, Amazon's the best place to try.
And also, you got some other wonderful books that people need to know about as well. But I want to ask you about this ForREst and his KKK connection, because, once again, just hanging around the apologists and supporters, they always say that his clan wasn't the same clan. It was more like a fraternal order. It was more about elites and stuff, not about the backwoods working class folk. So it was a different clan back then than the one we know today, or when it got resurged back in 1915 in Stone Mountain, Georgia. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, I think there is some truth to it, only in the sense that they were more disciplined under ForREst. They adopted a lot of ForREst's military strategies, including this. I described this circling of the horses. Well, they used to do that with their clan parades down the middle of little town. The main drags in little towns. They would do exactly the same thing to make onlookers, especially blacks and Catholics and Jews, believe that they had incredible, overwhelming numbers. But I think he was dissolved because he was losing control, and I think he also got distracted by just trying to hold his fortunes together. I think he just didn't have time to continue with it, and in his own way, he was probably too serious a man in some ways to continue with that idiocy, and I think that the version that came up during the lynching period was less disciplined, less centralized, and I don't think ForREst would have cared one way or the other about it, but I think there was some distinction to be made, but it was basically there to scare the hell out of black people and stop them from leaving the South and stop them from having any political or economic participation in the Southland.
Wow. Somebody used to do I'm trying to figure out, I'm in Memphis, and we got the statue with him and his wife remains buried underneath that statue. My thing is, why? Go ahead.
He didn't want to be buried.
Right, of course not.
He wanted to be buried with his men. It was the Klan. It was white, white politicians who saw him as the great embodiment of white hegemony. Who decided that it'd be a good idea to pull out his? It was a travesty to dig him up and put him under that statue in a public park. It's just it doesn't make any sense. And I know there was an effort to try to get his remains returned. I don't know where that stands. Can you?
Well, it's basically
can you enlighten me?
Well, this is considered a war memorial. It's protected by Tennessee law. The city council did vote to remove his remains and stuff that year when everything got crazy with the Confederate flag and whatnot. But because the state of Tennessee passed a law protecting and preserving war memorials, it's really kind of crazy. So the taxpayers in this over 50% black town, we are stuck with paying up the upkeep on the statue and his monument to white supremacy. And I think it should be privatized. I think it got to be a way to privatize that and not be, for the taxpayers to pay, because my thing does not benefit, people here in the city. And we're approaching the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. And it really brings home the point that it had to happen in Memphis, because it's the same place where they honor Nathan Bedford ForREst, where his living legacy is juvenile court, our private prisons. And you look at what they did to I.B. Wells Barnett when they ran out of town and out the South. And the Memphis massacre, which was started by white police officers, which led to them wanting to do the Reconstruction thing. Well, and so in Memphis, we got a heavy burden. It's a heavy burden to toll. But I think it needs to be like a Truth and Reconciliation Committee or something coming next year. I really do believe that for the 50th anniversary of King's assassination, there should be some type of tribunal or something here in Memphis where we make everything known, everything becomes more transparent about the dirty dealings of the city. Especially with ForREst as well.
I think that's a great idea. Is there any movement in that direction?
It got to be grassroots. It got to be people, because the institutions got their reasons for not wanting to, disclose that. They don't want to do that. I think it is an awakening, even with the Four Pillow thing. I think more people become educated about it. Because I had talked to Dick Gregory. He was in town doing a comedy show. He was real close to Dr. King. So he was here for April 3rd and the 4th. We had a 2-hour conversation. And I told him about the Four Pillow thing. He never heard of it. But he said, what you need to do is to keep on talking about it. Make it easy for people to access it. This is the age of information. Keep on putting it out there, because we got to create the environment for it to be really easy for folks to confront this issue of ForREst. Because even I live in Memphis, right? Folks still don't know what that is over there. They think it's a horse statue. Folks in the city don't even understand the significance of that place.
Stephen Lee, who was ForREst's commanding officer, although Forrest never obeyed him. But anyway, Stephen Lee, who was a head of the commander in chief of cavalry in the South or in the West, he actually set up an institution. The Sons of the Confederacy is sort of an extension of it, and their job was to go around and go after anybody who wrote anything derogatory about the Southern cause. And so, someone would write and say, I still am horrified by the legacy of the Fort Pillow massacre. They'd come in with, and hit them with all the propaganda that they had that it never happened, and it was the argument is it never happened and it wasn't our fault.
Right. Deny.
Anyway, deny. And but there was a concerted effort all through Reconstruction and well into the 1880s and 90s, in which any reference to slavery as the cause of the war, to massacres or mistreatment of black troops, that was not allowed. And eventually a lot of publishers, a lot of editors and publishers all over the country stopped running anything that was derogatory. And again, this was in the name of reconciliation between North and South. Well, part of that reconciliation was a denial of what had happened to black people.
Wow.
And so that was really, what you're dealing with is not just an absence of knowledge about this stuff, but the legacy of a concerted effort to keep this stuff up under wraps by the former officers of the Confederacy.
Wow. Wow. So you have anything else you want to add, Brother Andrew Ward, before we go? I don't want to keep you long. I really enjoyed talking to you and listening to you talk, actually.
I've enjoyed it myself. I always enjoy having a chance to shoot my mouth off.
Well, you got a lot to say. I want to thank you once again. I saw that C-SPAN presentation. You know what's funny? It ain't funny like haha. But every time I look at like a Civil War presentation on C-SPAN, if it's not hardly anybody in the room, it's nothing but white people in the room. Yeah. And there's always a Confederacy very well represented. Not really Union folks. Not pro-Union, more pro-Confederacy folks.
Well, there's a couple of, I've thought about that because I've spoken to a lot of Civil War roundtables, and even the ones that are primarily Union sympathizers, or descendants of Union soldiers. They're very rarely do I ever come upon an African American member of that group. And they ask me, why is that true? Why do I think that's so? And I said, I think it's because it's painful in a way that white people don't understand to contemplate slavery, and it's painful to be with people who don't understand what happened. Right. It's painful to have to be the one in the room to explain it. It's painful to be the one who's expected to have the African American take on something. It's very difficult to convince people. I did come upon one fellow who was dressed up as a Union. As a black Confederate. And that was how he dealt with it. Was to just
a lot of them too. I noticed that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So and so it's there are many reasons from both sides of why that's true. Certainly the Southern Civil War roundtables are dominated by descendants of Confederate ancestors, and probably that makes it even more forbidding. Although I did speak in New Orleans, and I was surprised that there were several black members there, and I think it changes the discussion a good deal to have African Americans present, because the ways white people comfort themselves about the way their ancestors behaved, they you're not as eager to trot that crap out. Black people are in the room.
Yeah, but the Institute of Slavery damaged everybody. It damaged Forrest. It damaged it. It damaged everybody. So it's so much trauma. Like even like I'm an artist, and I did a picture for my art exhibit about Fort Pillow Massacre, and it was like so much. It was too traumatic. Like I had to stop sometimes and stop working on it for days at a time. And because my thing is like, you're not only you remember ancestral trauma, but also I'm dealing with repressed trauma from dealing with this system of white supremacy, racism. It's memories that have came up that I thought I repressed, like that art guy, that type of stuff. People have done like, man, this is crazy. Then you're dealing with the ancestor pain, but I'm saying like, we never properly resolve any of this stuff. The Civil War is still going on. We got culture wars. There's war in every area of human activity.
Yeah.
Now they're trying to change the textbooks. Talking about we was indentured servants.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying? Crazy stuff like that. Volunteers. Yep. Oh, interns. They say interns, but
Well, the effort on the Stephen Lee's part included textbooks. Any textbook that mentioned slavery as having anything to do with the Civil War was edited out in a lot of those lot of cases, and so I mean it's important. It's very important to know this stuff and remember this stuff. It's hard. It's hard to shake it. I've written 3 books on 19th century African American history, all of them pertaining to slavery one way or another. And it's difficult. It's hard. The first attempt I made to try to write about African American history. I mean, I've been involved in the civil rights movement back in the 60s, but I had, a lot of us who had been involved, whites who had been involved in that, sort of, we kind of drifted away, and we got into the peace movement against the Vietnam War, and the Black Power movement didn't encourage us actually to take too active a part but looking at the source of this. I tried to write a book about a man who claimed to be Abraham Lincoln's slave relation, in that he was his father was a relative of Lincoln, and he was his son and his slave, this fellow just got under my skin. I spent 2 years following his trail through the South and through all kinds of archives and so on. It hurts, and it's also disorienting, because when you're first immersed in that history, you get so angry and you get so depressed that my writing, I take some pride in how I write. My writing, when I tried to write that book, was just off the, it was off the scale, off the charts. I was so full of indignation that I wasn't writing anything that was going to persuade anybody. It was just going to berate people. And I had to give it up. And that's when I wrote about the Jubilee Singers. But yeah, it's very difficult history. You don't just dip your toes into it. You have to really go at it with a will. And once you do, you begin to recognize everybody's humanity in that story. And what would I have done if I'd been a white born to a plantation owner whose wealth was dependent on slaves, and I had my father passes away, and what would I have done? Well, I think there are a great many white people who wouldn't know how to answer that question. We're all victims of circumstance, and when your whole world depends on an institution that's as wicked as slavery, it's awful hard to get out from under it. It's financial ruin. It's the disapprobation of your neighbors. It's not I don't mean to say that anybody should be terrifically, feel terrifically sorry for people who were slaveholders, but at the same time, it was a system like apartheid that had a stranglehold on everybody.
Right. And you know what? It's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up because when I was at the rally this past year at the ForREst rally around his statue and remains, there was one white man. He asked me a question. I never thought about it to that point. He asked me, "Well, you call me Brother Ron? Can you find any place in the Bible that says that slavery is a sin?" I said, well, interesting. It's not a part of the 10 Commandments. So is slavery a sin? Can you find anywhere in the Bible? I said, that's a good question. I know. But this form of slavery in America was totally different than a lot of other forms of slavery in human history.
No,
right?
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm not a religious man. I don't put much stock. I don't think of the Bible as my life's guide. I certainly don't see it as a history book. But that was written arguably by people living in a slave society, and that's there's all kinds of stuff in Ecclesiastes about they say stuff about. I'm sorry, do I have it right? Is it Ecclesiastes? I think so. But they're also telling you should never eat shellfish. You should never. There's all these things that have absolutely no relevance at all to the way human beings live, and now, or even should have lived back then. So that thinking that we have to kind of find some biblical reference to tell us whether or not slavery was a sin is absurd. It's just, that's just absurd. It was a brutal institution that was sustained purely out of greed and racism, and to argue that it's cute to argue that the Bible doesn't say it's a sin, but if you understand the spirit of the Bible, especially the New Testament, it's a sin. Damn straight, it's a sin.
Yes, sir. And also, before I let you go, have you ever seen the movie Goodbye, Uncle Tom?
I have not.
Oh, you heard about it? Have you heard about it?
I've heard about it. I've not seen it.
Yeah, I know it's online because the reason why I asked you that because I think people talk about this, all these slave movies. They call them slave movies that came out over the last several years, and a lot of folks, black folks in particular, have been traumatized by it. A lot of black folks don't agree with looking at all of that stuff like 12 Years a Slave, but that movie in particular really disturbed me. And was making it even more disturbing. It was based on primary sources.
12 years a slave. I was
talking about Goodbye, Uncle Tom, but yeah,
I thought that was as accurate, at least from my perspective as a historian. That was as accurate a portrayal of slavery as I've ever seen. And when I came home, my daughter-in-law is African American, and so I have these two gorgeous mixed race granddaughters, and I saw that I walked into my house and their pictures are up on my piano, and I looked at it and I just burst into tears. It was the first time that I had suddenly it really hit me what it meant that real human beings were put through this awful thing from childhood on. It's almost inconceivable that anybody could justify it. But I thought that was a brilliant movie. Now I don't know what the critique is of it, but it was based on his really extraordinary memoir.
Yeah.
And I just thought the complexity of it, the way in which some whites were trapped in it. The fellow who'd like to think of himself as a decent one, he ends up tying him to a tree and leaving him there. I just thought that was all really brilliantly done. I have to defend that movie. Just looking at it from perspective of having, read all of those slave narratives and having researched it, it just seemed to me that, yeah, that's what it was like. The one place where it seemed to me to stretch credulity was when Brad Pitt comes on and
right,
gets everything right.
White savior.
But yeah.
But but the thing about it is I went to Richmond last year, and the Lumpkin Jail historic site is still there by the train station, and they also got the African burial ground where Gabriel Prosser was executed and buried. And like the Lumpkin Jail pen in the movie, he was tortured at this jail site, and it's the Lumpkin Jail Center in Richmond. But the man who owned that jail cell was married to a black woman.
Yeah,
where they tortured all those slaves. But like what the good about Uncle Tom thing, it gets really graphic, and it used primary sources, diaries, newspaper accounts. It's like what it is like these documentary filmmakers. They're in the civil rights, Black Power era. They go back in the time into American history, and they document what's going on with slavery. Like with J. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, how he really tortured black women, and the sex slave market. They selling kids into sex slavery and the sex farms, and it's really, really graphic. And it was, I think, produced by some Italians. But I'm saying, I saw the movie, it just really disturbed me, and I couldn't erase it from my mind. So I can understand why people might be traumatized by these films.
I couldn't get there are a lot of people who are, nice, right-thinking people, but I could not convince them to go see it. They said, "Oh, it'll be too painful." I just said, "Well, yeah, that's right. It is painful. But that's why you got to see it." But they, I was really a hard sell. A hard sell. People were, it was really disturbing, as you say. It really was. I was deeply shaken by that movie, by 12 Years a Slave. But I'll have to look up Goodbye, Uncle Tom.
Well, have you seen the Underground series by any chance? Have you been looking at that at all?
Yeah, I did watch some of that.
What's your thoughts on that? I haven't seen it yet, but what are your thoughts on that, real quick? If you don't mind.
Well, I don't know. I don't really have a formed opinion about it. I know that a lot of folklore has, been built up around it, like the notion that people were, that black slaves were putting quilts out that had some secret code that would send people to the next safe haven and all that stuff. I am, the stories of the slaves who actually escaped, and Harriet Tubman is wonderful. But there is something about it that bothers me, and I think it's probably because there are white folks who are drawing comfort from it.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. That is a problem.
You know what I'm saying?
I feel good about myself. I hear you.
I look at it and I say, "Oh, yeah, that's right." Sure, there were slaveholders, but then there are all these nice people up in Ohio and Pennsylvania. That makes up for a lot. And you just want to say, no, it doesn't. It doesn't.
We needed more John Browns back then. Probably would have had no Civil War.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Ward, Brother Ward, it's an honor to have you on the show. I look forward to have you on again. Do you have any way that people can reach out to you if they want to find out more information about you or invite you to speak or whatever?
Well, yeah, let's see. How would I do that? Yeah, I've got let's see. I'm not exactly sure how I would do that. Let me maybe you could mention that on another show, and by then I'll figure it out.
But people can buy your books at Amazon, though. Yeah. River on Red, and also you cleared up something for me because some folks thought you was black. I guess the way you write and you're so sympathetic. I don't know. To the call, I had somebody say, "You sure he's black?" I said, "Maybe. I don't know. Maybe it could be past. I don't know." So you are a white male. You classify yourself as a white male.
Pass.
Okay, a lot of us pass. A lot of us, you got that going on. So you are a white male. You are a white man, correct?
I am indeed.
Okay, but people thought you was a brother for some reason. Okay.
Well, I'm flattered.
All right, brother boy, you take it easy. The words of Great Duke. Okay. Love you, manly. Keep on producing and pushing.
Many thanks.
Yes, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.